welcome. It's so lovely to have you join us this afternoon. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I am on, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people and the Bunurong people of the East Kulin Nations. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge Wurundjeri Elder Auntie Joy Murphy, who is also a patron of Children's Ground. And we'd love to know the lands from where you are watching this webinar. So if you would like to put that in the chat, we'd love to read that. My name is Megan Mundy. I work in the partnerships team at Children's Ground in Melbourne, and I'm also a former science teacher and a former teacher coach. So it's great to be here this afternoon. This webinar is hosted by Children's Ground, a First Nations-led organisation creating equity and access to high-quality education, health and economy in community for the next generation of children. In February, we launched the MK Turner Report in Canberra, advocating for a First Nations-led education system in Australia. And you can find out more about both Children's Ground and the MK Turner Report on our website. Every year, as a part of National Reconciliation Week, Children's Ground asks schools and workplaces to wear it yellow to raise funds for Children's Ground. And in the lead up to National Reconciliation Week, which is an opportunity for non-First Nations people to learn about the history of this land, we would like to take some time to explore different ways that teachers can practice truth-telling in their classrooms. We have three wonderful educators joining us today to share some of their experiences with you. And during this discussion, you can ask questions through the Q&A function or make comments in the chat. We're looking forward to answering some of your questions later in the session. So we'll get started. We'll start with Alinta. You are a primary trained teacher who's currently working for the Australian Education Union in Victoria. Could you tell us a little bit more about your background, your current context, and what truth-telling in the classroom means to you?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm living and learning on Wurundjeri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. I am a Ngunnawal Ngambri and Wurundjeri woman from Canberra originally, and I was a primary school teacher. Well, I am a primary school teacher, but I'm not currently teaching for about 15 years before I moved into my role at the AEU, where I'm a First Nations organiser. So I now work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members of the Australian Education Union to bring voice and representation into the organisation for MOB so that people have an understanding about what works for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in schools and other workplaces, and to give opportunity to these members to learn about entitlements and the structures in which that they're teaching and how they can use those entitlements to, work within a system that is a Western colonised system in which we work. What was the other thing, Megan?
And what does truth-telling in the classroom mean to you, or why is it important?
So it's really important, it means that students and broader community, friends and family, understanding, acknowledging and respecting the stories of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We know as a society the impact and consequence of not knowing those stories and the generations of silence, silencing those stories and experiences. So that's why it's important.
Thanks, Alinta. Tino, as a secondary English teacher in Alice Springs, could you tell us a little bit more about your context and what truth-telling means to you?
Hi all, my name is Tino. I'm coming to you from central Arnda country in Mumbantua, Alice Springs. I'd like to also acknowledge the elders past, present, and all of the knowledge that we have here in this room today. So thank you so much for joining. I work at a independent private school in Alice Springs called St. Philip's College. Part of our work here is working with youths from remote and rural communities from all throughout the Northern Territory, from as far up as Borroloola to all the way across the Central Australia. As a as a teacher, for what truth telling means to me is about acknowledging the injustices and of the past and the resilience of the people who endured them, but also examining how they inform our present moment. My aim within the classroom is really to help students consider what steps they need to take or what we can take in order to build a more equitable and just future. So yeah, I'm really excited to join you here today. Yeah.
Fabulous. Thanks, Tina. And where's your accent from? Where do you hail from originally?
Yep, I'm Cuban American, now Australian. So born in Cuba, grew up in Chicago, and have lived in Australia, first in Melbourne and now in Alice Springs since 2015.
Wow, quite the journey.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Jerome, you're a secondary teacher in Melbourne. Can you tell us more about your context and truth telling from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. I'm talking from Northcote High School on Wurundjeri country. And my journey was I didn't learn a lot of this stuff at high school, but went and did some Indigenous studies subjects under Dr. Wayne Atkinson, Uncle Wayne, and Gary Foley, who I was lucky enough to have as a tutor. And it's kind of been my own personal journey of learning. And then when I became a teacher or decided to become a teacher, yeah, much later, I've always wanted to bring in this, the history that I learned and that I've continued to learn into the classroom, about the reframing a lot of the injustices and the way that, that young people learn about it, and also telling the stories of, of resilience, as Tino said, and even cooperation in some instances. So yeah.
Fabulous. Thank you. We're going to dive in a bit deeper now. I'd love to hear from each of you about truth telling that you've either facilitated in your classroom or in your school, or that you've seen other teachers in your network do with their classroom. So we'll start with you, Alinta, in the primary school scene. Tell us about truth telling that you've facilitated or seen.
Thank you. I mean, one example, I guess, is when I've been with my class in a primary school setting. So that's from prep. I've mostly taught junior and specialists, so art and drama as well. We always talk about place. We talk about what country we're on. As a prep teacher, we would do it at the beginning of the day, and acknowledgement of country, and that didn't just come from nothing, and we didn't just do it to do it. It was a collaborative process with the students, community members, any families that wanted to get involved. And it became sort of that acknowledgement of where we're learning it's so important to understand the stories and the histories of that place, and unpacking that with the students. And we'd have conversations about stolen land. We'd have conversations about things that had happened in that place. And what would come from that is students would have that foundation already before we even start our learning for the day. They would understand we are on Aboriginal land. This is why it's important to know that. These are the things that have happened. There are some sad things, there are some joyful things that we can move forward with. So it was something really simple, but something really effective, and a great way to start conversations with students and community members. When it comes to different events throughout the year, like National Sorry Day, there's a fantastic resource, school resource, that the Healing Foundation has available on its website, and it has a number of resources from prep to year 12, a lot of videos. It's really prescriptive in a good way, in that really you could pick it up and follow it, and students would get a really, really strong understanding of stolen generation and the importance of knowing those stories and what we can do in the future to ensure that we're not perpetuating these awful injustices. What we would do for that day is have an sort of acknowledgement ceremony. We'd have a smoking ceremony. We'd invite local community and different stakeholders to come along and be involved. There'd be sort of a walk that we do throughout the gardens where students and teachers and families could sort of contemplate what that meant, what stolen generation means and the impacts of that. And I guess what I would say is that I was able to lead a lot of that work as an Aboriginal person in the school. And I think before you can embark on a lot of this work, there's work that you need to do. I think Jerome alluded to this himself. There's work that you need to do individually to understand why this is so important. And, you know, a great step is, of course, coming to a webinar such as this to get you started if you haven't already, but also your own personal journey and experiences of colonisation and how you contend with the different power structures in which we work with and what your unconscious bias is, what your privilege might be. So I think there's a bit of work to do before some of that truth-telling is implemented in a practical way in a school setting.
Wow, yeah. So important to really feel like you have an understanding of it yourself and become aware of some of the culture that we've been brought up in before facilitating it in the classroom. Thanks, Alinta. Jerome, in your context, what are some ways that you've facilitated truth-telling in your classroom or things that your school has done?
Yeah, my school has a system of electives for year 9 and 10 where students can choose all of their subjects. So I've written an elective called Indigenous Rights and Freedoms. It's a semester-long history subject that kind of takes students on a journey that examines, you know, the first unit's called Separation and Control, second unit Movements for Rights and Freedoms, and then the third one, Justice, Reconciliation and Recognition. So we take students on a journey, from sort of pre and post colonization right up until the present moment and look at the key kind of case studies that we examine. So we look at a case study of Corinder. We look at the kind of fight for justice and equality and the Aboriginal 10 Embassy, among others. And then we look at kind of the present context of almost like Aboriginal deaths in custody, you know, the Mabo decision and, you know, reconciliation and what that means without kind of going too overboard. So, yeah, I mean, the thing that I would recommend, there's so many amazing resources like in the last 10 years that have been created. So Aboriginal Change Makers, which was made by Auntie Lois Peeler, who's Wurundjeri Yorta woman, is amazing. And then 2 documentary series by Rachel Perkins, The Australian Wars and First Australians, are kind of like must sees, and they're so well articulated and so well researched for any history teachers out there. A really good starting points.
I've been doing some work both in my classroom at the classroom level and now as the head of the English department. I'm trying to create space and resources to sort of decolonize a bit of our curriculum. But I'll speak first to what I'm doing or what I've done in the class so far. This year in year 10, we worked on a unit with the film The Hate You Give. It's based off the novel by the same name by Angie Thomas, and it centers around a young woman named Star Carter, who, after witnessing the murder of her friend by a police officer, finds her voice and is able to speak for him. It centers around, I guess, the ideas of the Black Lives Matter movement, more specifically in the USA. But we've used that as a mirror to reflect back on what's happening here in Australia. So something that we've done and able to do is to connect it not only to the Black Panther Party is a big part of the film and of the novel, and then thinking about how that links to Indigenous liberation movements here in Australia. More locally, we've been able to really tie and given us a really strong framework to understand the Kumanjai Walker inquest that happened this past year in the Northern Territories in Alice Springs, the same time that we were watching the movement or the movie and studying the film. The students could see on the steps of our courthouse the protests that were occurring and all of the news items that were coming out during that time. So it allowed students to have a really nuanced understanding of the issues that were happening there. So that's just something that I've helped to facilitate in terms of my classroom. But now that I've recently become the head of English, I'm trying to find ways to integrate not only more First Nations stories and perspectives into our work, but just and also ensuring that at every year level there's something there that students can hold on to that has a real strong curriculum focus. Sometimes I worry that a lot of the work that I'm doing can be superficial in terms of how I work with our reconciliation action plan committee. So I'm trying to find ways to support not only in the English department, but the teachers across the curriculum to deeply embed Indigenous perspectives throughout the whole school. So that's what we're working towards right now as well.
Wow, thanks. And thanks for holding the fort while we dropped out here with some technical issues. Thanks for carrying on. It's really interesting to hear about all of those different contexts from primary school where, you know, one teacher has control over their class for most of the week to an elective where you created a subject that students could select, and then from the head of English perspective, when you're talking about a mainstream subject and incorporating it into everyday curriculum in your school. You also touched on some sort of school-wide work you were doing with your RAP. Jerome, could you tell us a little bit more about the work your library did in this space?
Yeah, of course. So like our librarians were looking through our collection and noticed that a lot of things are out of date, and there's actually a lot of historical inaccuracies in some of the books that we had. And they went on a huge process that took about 2 years of decolonizing the library. So they Diana and Richard spent time working with Dr. Al Fricker from Deakin University, who's a specialist in Indigenous education, and he created a framework for analyzing the library books in the collection and which ones didn't fit the criteria and were historically inaccurate or hadn't been used for decades, and then putting them, replacing them with new resources, that were better and more historically accurate, basically. So so it was an amazing process. And he taught our librarians what to do and what to look for, and sort of oversaw the process. But they very much, did a lot of the grunt work, reading through and going through, hundreds and hundreds of books. And those have since been archived. I've forgotten the university that took them, but I think they're either still in our in the back of the library, or they've been donated to a university that keeps like those historical records as well. So yeah.
Wow, there's so many different ways you can approach this work, from a micro level every day in your classroom with your students to that sort of macro school-wide project. That's really great to hear. I'm going to ask Alinta a question now. Often when non-First Nations teachers are doing this work, people turn to First Nations teachers to ask lots of questions. And I'm wondering if you could explain to us what the concept of cultural or colonial load is, and what should non-First Nations educators be aware of?
Yeah, that's right. So often it is the responsibility of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teachers to sort of guide any of this work. If you're in a school or workplace that wants to do it, and what can happen then, it can lead to what already is a very demanding job being even more demanding. So yeah, the concept of colonial load is the load kind of placed on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to do the work of that perhaps other people could do. So, for example, in my context as a primary school teacher, I was teaching my class, but also then organising the NAIDOC Week Assembly, and also organising whatever was happening for any events, community events. And I wanted to do that as an Aboriginal teacher out of obligation to that cultural obligation or responsibility that I feel towards the students and the community. I happen to work at a school with a really high population of Aboriginal kids, and so I wanted those students to have that sense of belonging and connection to their school, and for their family and community to feel the same way, that it was a safe space to be. So you want to do it, and you do it, but it can, really lead to burnout, because there's an expectation that you're going to be able to pull off these community events and do these, go above and beyond. So it also happens because we often work in isolation. Unfortunately, there's not many of us in schools, and there's all of these sort of restrictive frameworks and structures in which we work that are, the Western colonial structures. There's also a lot of deficit narratives that continue and perpetuate this sort of feeling of being othered, I guess, in the space. So there's lots of things going on there, and I guess if colleagues can just have that knowing and understanding, and maybe ask questions about it. What can I help with? I see you've taken a lot on. Is there anything I can do? What else do you work on in your classroom? Because, maybe I was doing things in my classroom that I wasn't always telling people about, because again, you tend to work in isolation. So being really proactive in understanding the experience of your colleagues. Thank you. So just referencing Withunga, which is a health organisation who brought out a few tiles around colonial load and reframing it. It's been called cultural load for a while, but actually the colonial load is sort of more true, speaking of truth-telling, to what it is. It's imposed. It's not. Culture is actually, something that is our strength. So, as it says here, be sure to check biases, assumptions, expectations, and ask, can you help? Can you be more present? Thanks.
Thanks, Alinta. It's really important to remember that we all need to share this load. It shouldn't just fall to First Nations teachers to educate other teachers, but also take the lead on this work in their schools. And I guess it comes from a place of wanting to find out and be sensitive and not get things wrong, but there's the other side of that equation as well. We were going to talk a little bit more about resources, but we've covered it. So there's a whole list of resources that we've put in the chat. Someone asked, what were the videos that you mentioned? I can't remember whether it was Jerome or Tino, the videos.
Yeah, I think it was me. So the first one is the First Australians documentaries, and it's by Rachel Perkins, and it's on SBS. You can watch it SBS On Demand. And then the second one was her new series called Australian Wars. And that really covers all of the frontier wars that have been kind of left out of, or not left out, they've very much been present, but this is very, very well documented with many historical sources. So it's just a fantastic insight for anyone, that's teaching kind of those periods or that wants to learn more anyway. And they're really well made.
Thanks, Jerome. And as we mentioned earlier, a great place to start is to watch some of these series yourself and really, really understand the impact that our history has on the land that we're living in. Is there any other advice that leave this open to anyone? Is there any other advice that you would give to someone who really doesn't know where to start or where to begin in their school?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I might say that it's on top of educating ourselves and connecting with community members and developing a strong sense of where you are on country. I would also, I guess, stress to teachers that it's not only just the content that we're teaching or that we're showing to the students, but it's also the way that we approach our students and the relationships that we build with them and the pedagogical choices that we use to inform all of our teaching practices. So if we want to be as equitable as possible with our students, we have to be aware of our own of how we're teaching and the culture that we use to inform our teaching. And sometimes that means, I think, having like just also recognizing that a lot of us are already doing so many good things. So if you're telling stories, if you're connecting with your students, if you're using scaffolding or explicit teaching, these are all elements that inform the 8 ways pedagogy, and that's a thing that you can take with you, leaving this seminar, is that you're already on the road, even if you don't necessarily realize it, just through the choices that you're making in your classroom, because culturally responsive teaching or Indigenous informed teaching practices are also just good teaching practices. So making sure that you're already on the way, even if you don't know.
Thanks, Gino. Jerome, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I was. I think just not be scared to give it a go. And when you're not sure about something, let the resource and the videos speak for themselves, and then unpack that with the students. And they're out there in terms of the resources. Like if you just look at Aboriginal change makers and then some of the Rachel Perkins documentaries, you're in an amazing spot, because what Auntie Lois Peeler put together are all of the key activists and change makers that were Aboriginal in the kind of from first contact right up until kind of the late, I think the last ones are around the 60s and 70s. Yeah. Gary Foley's on there as well. Yeah, and those voices speak for themselves. So yeah, don't be scared and just give it a go. And then also reach out to VAI, are an amazing organization to get in touch with, to ask about who your local people are, because they've got a huge list of Koori educators and people if you're in Victoria. And Wurundjeri Corporation as well, do incursions and do amazing cultural experiences for for students from primary school and high school. So yeah.
Great. It's great to see a few questions coming through in the chat. In a minute, we'll be starting to answer those. So if you've thought of one, now's a great time to pop it in. But before we throw to that, could you tell us, perhaps I'll start with you, Tino, could you tell us some of the responses you've seen from students, or what impact has this work had on students that you've seen?
In my context, change is slow, but I think just speaking to, I guess, the most recent example that I have of having the Hate You Give with my year 10 students, I was able to, in the assessment test that they completed for that unit, they just demonstrated a much better understanding of the systemic issues that informed the Zachary Rolfe trial, and like the kid, like the inquest that was happening at the moment. So that, I guess, gave me a lot of hope in terms of the impact that I saw my teaching having on my students, being able to develop a really nuanced and strong understanding of what was happening and what is happening in Australia. I think the other point that I guess I want to make is that it takes a long time for our students to understand and to work towards these changes, and I feel like any small win that I have with them, any insight that they sort of develop, has been really, yeah, impressive for me to just see from them. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Alinta or Jerome, did you have anything to add? What impact have you seen from this work on your students or in your classrooms?
I think for me, just similarly, like the impact is that there's a collective understanding and acknowledgement and respect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, histories, perspectives that students are getting from, all the way from early childhood in classrooms now. And you're seeing the impact of that as students are moving through their education, is that awareness of why this is important and the shift towards strength-based understandings of Aboriginal people. Sure, we also see some stuff that we wouldn't like to see in schools and classrooms, but generally speaking, I see the impact of the students knowing is really, really positive, that understanding that they're living and learning on Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander land, on stolen land, and the history involved in that, and that awareness that they take with them into all that they do in a respectful way is, I've seen that all the way, students that I'm still in contact with, they're, now themselves either working in organisations and influencing, lots of other institutions and organisations with this knowing that they've had throughout their schooling. So that's really exciting.
Thanks, Alinta. And Jerome, from teaching your subject in that elective, like what did you see throughout that semester?
Yeah, I think the knowledge just it helps boost their confidence and their just understanding of history and their connection to where they're from and where they've grown up. Recently, like we've noticed that some of the students that took my elective have gone on to sort of student leadership and other positions. Recently, a group of Year 10 students set up a makers market on a Sunday morning that all the proceeds went to the Aboriginal Housing Corporation, because so they're reaching out and they're connecting with the Aboriginals Advancement League and different organisations. Do you know what I mean? To make things happen, we've got First Nations captains as well here, and they were consulted when I worked with them when I was creating the subject that I ran. But we also have a reconciliation action plan and have made a bunch of changes in the school that I won't get into that we're really proud of. And there's a lot of steps still to go, but I think it just like a small flame can start a fire, and it's just about building that knowledge and awareness, and awareness and understanding of truth and us, going through that process together.
Great. We've got a couple of questions coming through the chat, and please keep putting them in as they come to mind. But we've had some people who are working in the early years space with children in preschool who are 4 or 3 or even younger. Do any of you have any ideas of where resources that could work for educators in that age group?
There's a really great organization called Common Ground that provide resources for educators. One of the series that they do is called like bedtime stories, which has these really beautiful videos of stories being told on country with free resources to sort of facilitate discussions. And I think maybe for younger students, that might be a good place to begin.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great place to go and start. Also, Magabala Books, which is a Aboriginal publishing company, has all these incredible books and picture books that have teaching resources, and they have early years resources there. So I think that was one of the resources that's gone into the chat. And also Narragansett. I'm not sure if if that is a resource that's gone into the chat already, but that again has early years resources. But I think in the same way that I talked about things that you can do in primary school and even in high school. You can easily adapt those. And there's something great that happens in the early years space with a certain amount of the different type of pedagogical practice that happens there that allows the more exploration of outdoor spaces, more exploration of children focused learning, that really is a very rich opportunity to do all of these learnings. There is, I'm not sure if it's based in Victoria only, and I don't know much about it, sorry, but there is something called possum skin pedagogy, which is sort of focused on possum skins and how you can use them to teach Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing in the classroom. So that could be a good resource too.
And Beth from the chat has also suggested a resource called WAYAPA, W-A-Y-A-P-A. So we might put a link to that in the chat as well. Thanks for sharing that, Beth. And if anyone else has any suggestions, please feel free to share. Alinta, a question for you. What practical ways can allies support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teachers and education staff?
I think, I sort of touched on this a little bit around making those connections, asking questions, understanding how your work can support the work that often Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teachers and educators and education support staff are doing. But I think something else that you can be really aware of in your allyship is how you are, I suppose, either perpetuating the status quo of these different systems or questioning or challenging certain things. So if I saw my colleagues sort of wonder about a certain practice or process or challenge it, that would be showing me solidarity in a moment where I might feel really isolated, to put my hand up and say, hey, why are we doing something this way? Why are we so focused on this student, being out of uniform when this student's turning up to school every day, happy to come? Let's sort of, shift that narrative so that we're not so focused on, like I said, maintaining the status quo, but helping challenge it and question it and disrupt it a little bit, I think would definitely be supportive for any colleagues that you have that might be First Nations.
So to feel like you're not the only voice in the room standing up for these things, but to feel supported by your colleagues would be nice.
Yes. Yeah.
Excellent. I might share one last question, unless a few more come through in the chat, but what do you need to be aware of as an educator when exploring this content with young people? Jerome, I might start with you. What would you say you need to be aware of when starting this content with your students?
I think be aware that the students are going to come with a range of opinions and ideas. And I think it's really important not to shut them down, but to acknowledge, where those ideas might come from and like really sort of tease out what the other classmates think, what impact that might have on, on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or, who's telling which perspectives in history. So I think allowing that conversation to happen and allowing them to air those things is really important. We don't want to have a situation where they're too scared to, test out ideas and express things, even if they might be, so incorrect or offensive or damaging, within reason, of course, as long as it's respectful. But that's something that I think is important to me.
So creating a safe space where people can actually bring their honest thoughts and that's where real change can happen, when people feel like.
And one more thing, I guess, also like cultural safety, so understanding who's in the room and what, as much of the backgrounds that you can, and just being aware of, what sort of materials you're showing, and that sometimes you will look through a certain lens based on your own, history and upbringing, and being really frank about like, oh, like this is me, this is what I've learned, and we're learning together and exploring things together. I think that's a really nice way of putting it, and being a bit more disarming, not being the one who knows everything, but going on the journey with the students if you don't feel like you've got an in-depth knowledge and that you're always learning. Yeah.
Alinta, what would you say to be aware of as an educator? And you might also want to speak as your perspective as a mother as well.
I think everything that Jerome said was great in that, if you have created a learning space where students can feel like they can contribute, they can ask questions, that there's an equalizer there. So saying that you're not the expert in the room, that there's learning that we can do together. And yeah, part of that is understanding who is in these spaces and perhaps what experiences they've had and what options you can sort of give around sort of, practical things like I think I was talking to a teacher recently and they had watched a movie that, is it called Higher Ground? I'm not sure, sorry, I've forgotten the name of the movie, but the first scenes are massacre scenes, and sort of talking about what's a safe way to approach that with students and what options can you give them, not just sort of press play, here we go, but really being aware of what are the steps that you need to take before you do press play, and who might it impact and what conversations would you be having. So yeah, just being really, really aware of all of that before you start anything.
Thanks, Alinta. That's really important to be aware of. Tina, do you have anything to add? No, great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We've mentioned Wear It Yellow, which is an opportunity for schools to fundraise for Children's Ground, but also to promote Reconciliation Week in their schools. And you can sign up for that on our website. We're also hosting a truth-telling PD session for teachers in Melbourne on the 24th of July. We've put some links to that in the chat. We will be sending out an email today or tomorrow with all of the links that we've shared with you today, with some more information about Wear It Yellow and the truth-telling PD. So that will be hitting your inboxes soon. We've also recorded this session so you can watch it back later or share it with some colleagues who weren't able to join us today. But I'd just like to take this time to really thank our educators who have joined us from very busy lives and schedules today. So thank you, Alinta, Jerome and Tino, for sharing your insights today. And thank you for everyone who's participated in the webinar today. It's been great to have your input, to have your questions, but also to have your presence here with us and your willingness to learn more in this space.